"You are not a homeowner type," my landlord said as he slid the new lease across the counter, his voice flat, casual, like he had said it 100 times before to people just like me. I didn't argue. I didn't even look up right away. I just stared at the number printed in bold. $1,650. Up again. Always up. I reached into my bag, pulled out a pen that barely worked, and signed my name anyway, because at that moment he was right. I had $84 in my checking account, and nowhere else to go. I walked back to my unit, second floor, Building C. The hallway smelled like old carpet and something fried from downstairs. The same flickering light above my door buzzed as I unlocked it. Inside was 600 square feet of survival. One couch I bought used, one small table by the window, and a mattress on the floor for my daughter when she came home from classes. I dropped my keys in a chipped bowl and checked my phone. 3 missed notifications. One from the electric company, one from my credit card, one from DoorDash reminding me about peak hours. I kicked off my shoes, poured myself a glass of tap water, and sat down without turning on the lights. It was cheaper that way, I told myself. Just until things got better. They always said things get better, but no one tells you when. At 47, I worked the front desk at a dental clinic from 8 to 5, smiled at patients, scheduled cleanings, answered the same questions over and over. Then I got in my car and drove until midnight delivering food to people who tipped $2 and sometimes nothing at all. On weekends, I cleaned short-term rentals for people who probably never thought about the woman scrubbing their bathroom floors. I kept my receipts in a folder, tracked every dollar, counted gas by the gallon, $12 at a time, never a full tank, never enough to feel ahead. I opened my banking app again just to be sure. $84. I let out a slow breath, not dramatic, just steady, because panic didn't pay rent. I stood up, grabbed my jacket, and headed back out. The sun was already going down over the parking lot. Rows of cars that all looked tired in the same way. I passed my landlord's truck near the office, shiny, new, untouched by anything I recognized as struggle. He didn't see me, or maybe he did, and it didn't matter. To him I was just another tenant. Another name on a lease, another late fee waiting to happen. I got into my car, turned the key, and listened to the engine hesitate before catching, like it was thinking about quitting too. I rested my hands on the steering wheel for a moment, then pulled out into traffic, because stopping wasn't an option. Not anymore. Not after everything that had already gone wrong. They thought I would stay exactly where I was, stuck, predictable. Someone who rents forever, and maybe for a long time they were right. But what they didn't see, what no one saw, was that I had already started paying attention to numbers, to patterns, to things people assumed I wouldn't understand. And that night, driving through streets lit by neon signs and fast food windows, I realized something small but sharp. I didn't need permission to change my life. I just needed a way in, and once I found it, everything, absolutely everything, was going to change. I learned to measure my life in small numbers, in miles driven, in hours worked, in dollars left after everything else had already taken its share. The next morning I woke up before sunrise, not because I wanted to but because I had to. The alarm on my phone buzzed at 5:30, and for a moment I just stared at the ceiling, counting the cracks in the paint like I had done so many mornings before. I rolled out of bed, careful not to make noise even though the apartment was empty. Old habits stay even when life changes. I poured coffee into a chipped mug and checked my schedule for the day. 8 hours at the clinic, then straight into driving until midnight. Maybe later if the orders were steady. I glanced at the calendar on the wall. Rent due in 10 days. And my account still under $100. I did the math in my head, again, like I always did, and it still did not work. It never worked. Not on paper, not in reality, but somehow I kept going. I always kept going. The dental clinic smelled like mint and antiseptic, the same clean scent that made people feel safe. I sat behind the front desk, answering calls, confirming appointments, smiling at patients who never noticed how tired my eyes were. A woman came in complaining about the cost of her procedure, saying it was ridiculous to pay that much for something so small. I nodded and understood, even though in my head I was calculating how many hours of driving that same amount of money would cost me. My manager walked by, reminded me to stay positive, said patients could feel energy. I smiled again, the kind of smile that stayed on the surface and never reached anywhere deeper. By lunchtime, I had not eaten. I told myself I was not hungry, but really I was saving that $10 for gas later. I drank water instead, filled my stomach with something that did not cost anything. Around 3 in the afternoon, I overheard 2 coworkers talking near the break room. One of them laughed and said she just closed on a new house, 3 bedrooms, big backyard, her voice full of excitement. The other asked how she managed it, and she said her husband handled most of it. Good credit, good timing. I kept walking, pretending I did not hear, pretending it did not matter, but it did, more than I wanted to admit, because it reminded me of something I had been told too many times, that home ownership was for people who had help, for people who started earlier, for people who did not make mistakes like I did. After work, I got into my car and turned on the delivery app. The map lit up with red zones, peak hours, more orders, more chances to earn. I accepted the first request without thinking. Picked up food from a restaurant that smelled better than anything I had eaten in weeks, and delivered it to a house with a long driveway and bright lights in every window. The customer opened the door, thanked me quickly, and closed it before I could even say anything back. I stood there for a second, looking at the house, at the size of it, at the way it felt permanent. Then I turned around and walked back to my car. Another order came in, then another. Time blurred into movement, into traffic lights and receipts and navigation instructions. Around 10:30 at night, I parked near a gas station, engine idling, and finally ate something small, a sandwich I bought earlier for $3. I checked my earnings for the day. It was something, not enough, never enough, but something. I leaned back in my seat and looked at the dashboard, at the faint reflection of my face in the dark windshield, and for the first time in a long time, I did not just see exhaustion. I saw questions, real ones, about why I was stuck, about who decided that this was all I could be. I thought about the building I lived in, about the empty units, about the broken things that never got fixed, about the landlord who always raised the rent but never improved anything, and something shifted, quiet but clear, because for the first time I was not just accepting the situation, I was studying it, piece by piece, like a problem that could actually be solved. I started noticing things I had ignored before, small details that used to blur into the background but now stood out clearly, like the empty unit across from mine that had been vacant for 3 months, the broken mailbox near the stairs that no one ever fixed, the peeling paint along the hallway that kept getting worse. I had always assumed it was just part of renting, part of living in a place that was not yours, but now it felt different, like evidence of something bigger, something not being managed the way it should be. One evening after a long shift, I walked past the office and saw the lights still on, the door slightly open. I did not mean to stop, but I did, just for a second, long enough to hear my landlord talking on the phone. His voice lower than usual, tense. He said something about deadlines, about payments being behind, about needing more time. I kept walking, but the words stayed with me, repeating in my head as I climbed the stairs to my unit. Payments behind. That did not match the image he always showed, the confident tone, the way he talked about raising rent like it was nothing. Later that night I sat at my table with my laptop open, something I had started doing more often. Searching, reading, trying to understand things I used to ignore. I typed in simple questions at first. How apartment buildings make money, what happens when property taxes are not paid, what foreclosure actually means. Each answer led to another. Each page opened a door I did not know existed. I learned that buildings like mine were not just places people lived. They were numbers, income, expenses, risks. I learned that empty units were not just empty. They were losses, that repairs not being done could mean cash flow problems, that late payments to banks could lead to something much bigger than a rent increase. I leaned back in my chair and thought about everything I had seen over the past year. The maintenance requests ignored, the sudden changes in rent policies, the way my landlord avoided certain questions. It started to form a pattern, not a complete picture yet, but enough to make me pay closer attention. The next day at the clinic, I found myself distracted, not by stress, but by curiosity. I asked one of the older patients, a man who came in every few months and always talked about business, what he did before retirement. He smiled and said he used to own rental properties, several of them. I asked him what made a good deal. He laughed softly and said it was not about finding something perfect, it was about finding something broken that you knew how to fix. That stayed with me for the rest of the day. Something broken, something fixable. That night while driving, I started looking at my building differently, not as a place I was stuck in, but as something I could analyze. I noticed which units had lights on, which ones stayed dark. I remembered conversations with neighbors who complained about issues never resolved. I even started writing things down in a small notebook I kept in my car, numbers, observations, anything that felt important. It was not a plan yet, not even close, but it was a shift, a quiet one, from surviving inside a system to trying to understand it. And the more I learned, the more I realized that the situation I had accepted for years might not be as fixed as it seemed. There were cracks, not just in the walls, but in the way everything was being held together, and for the first time I began to wonder if those cracks were not just signs of weakness, but openings, small chances that most people would walk past without ever seeing. But I was no longer most people, not anymore. I began to test my assumptions in small ways, careful not to draw attention, careful not to look like anything had changed, because on the outside nothing had. I still showed up to work on time, still answered phones with the same calm voice, still drove late into the night delivering food to strangers, but inside something had shifted, something quiet and steady. I started asking better questions, not out loud but in my own head, questions about numbers, about ownership, about control. One afternoon during a slow hour at the clinic, I opened my laptop and pulled up public records for properties in my area. It took time to understand what I was looking at, but I stayed with it, scrolling through data, learning how to read what most people never bother to check: tax history, ownership details, transaction dates. I typed in the address of my building and paused for a second before hitting search, like I was crossing a line I could not uncross. The results came up slowly, line by line. Numbers and names and dates. At first it did not make sense, but then patterns started to appear. The property had not changed ownership in years, but the tax records showed delays, payments made late, sometimes just enough to avoid penalties. Not the behavior of someone in full control. I leaned closer to the screen, reading everything again, more carefully this time. I noticed something else: a lien filed months ago, small but significant, a signal that something was not being handled the way it should be. I sat back and let that sink in. This was not just a building, it was a situation, one that was more fragile than it looked from the outside. That night while driving, I replayed the information in my head, connecting it with everything I had already observed: the empty units, the ignored repairs, the conversations I had overheard. It all lined up, not perfectly but enough to form a direction. I did not feel excited, not yet. It was more like clarity, like finally seeing the edges of something that had been blurry for too long. The next step was not obvious, but I knew it had to start with me, with what I could control. I checked my credit score again. 582, still low. Still a problem, but now it felt like a number I could work with, not a permanent label. I made a list that night, sitting at my small table with a pen that scratched across the paper. Pay down the smallest debt first, call the credit union, ask about secured options, track every expense, cut anything that was not necessary. It was not a big plan, not something that would impress anyone, but it was real, and more important, it was mine. Over the next few weeks, I followed it without exception. No shortcuts, no excuses. I skipped takeout completely, cooked simple meals, beans, rice, eggs, whatever stretched the furthest. I picked up extra shifts when I could, even when I was tired. Especially when I was tired, because now every dollar had a purpose beyond just surviving the month. It was building something, slowly, quietly. I called the credit union during a break and asked questions I used to be too embarrassed to ask. The woman on the phone explained things in simple terms, options I had never considered, small steps that could lead somewhere bigger if I stayed consistent. I wrote everything down, every detail, every instruction, like it mattered, because now it did. When I returned home at night, I no longer saw the apartment the same way. I saw numbers, potential, risk. I saw a system that could be understood, maybe even entered, if I was willing to keep going long enough. And for the first time in years, the idea of staying where I was did not feel like a trap. It felt like a starting point. I stopped thinking in weeks and started thinking in months, because nothing I was doing would change my life overnight. Not really. It was all slow, steady, almost invisible progress, but it was different now because every action had a direction. Every dollar had a purpose. I began tracking everything with discipline I had never had before. I wrote down every expense in a small notebook: groceries, gas, bills, even the smallest purchases, and for the first time I saw where my money was actually going, not where I thought it was going. That alone changed how I moved through my days. I stopped reacting and started choosing. One night after finishing a long shift, I sat in my car outside the building and looked up at the dark windows, counting them, trying to estimate how many units were occupied, how many were empty. I had already noticed the pattern, but now I was documenting it, unit by unit, floor by floor. I spoke casually with neighbors when I could, asking simple questions without making it obvious. How long had they lived there? Had rent gone up recently? Had maintenance responded to their requests? Most of them said the same things in different ways: delays, issues, uncertainty, people moving out faster than new ones moving in. It confirmed what I was beginning to understand. This building was not stable, not in the way it needed to be. One evening I saw a notice taped near the office door. It looked official, but not something tenants usually paid attention to. I walked closer, pretending to check my phone while reading it carefully. It mentioned a deadline, a payment issue tied to the property. Not detailed enough for most people to notice, but enough for me to recognize what it meant. Pressure was building on the owner, real pressure, not just inconvenience. That night I could not sleep right away. I sat at my table with my laptop open, searching for more information. I learned about distressed properties, about how owners sometimes had to sell quickly to avoid bigger losses, about how those moments created opportunities for people who were prepared. I did not feel ready, not even close. But I was closer than I had ever been. I pulled up my own numbers again. My credit score had inched up, 602 now, still not strong, but moving. My savings was small but growing, every week adding something, even if it was just $20. It mattered because it was consistent. I realized that I was no longer just reacting to problems. I was positioning myself, slowly, quietly, without anyone noticing. The next day at the clinic, I called the credit union again. During my break, asked more questions, this time about partnerships, about what it would take to be part of a deal even if I could not qualify a loan. The woman on the phone explained that lenders look for more than just one number. They look at the whole picture. Income stability, potential, partnerships. She said deals are built, not just approved. I wrote that down. Deals are built. That stayed with me, because it meant I did not have to wait until everything was perfect. I just had to be ready enough to step in when the moment came. Later that week, while driving, I passed a small duplex with a for sale sign. I slowed down just for a second, looking at it differently than I would have before, not as something out of reach, but as something that followed rules, numbers, structure. I began to understand that ownership was not about luck. It was about knowing where to stand when the door opened. And as I pulled back into my parking space that night, I looked at my building again, at the cracks, the empty units, the signs of strain, and for the first time I did not see a place I was stuck in. I saw something shifting, something that might not hold together much longer, and if that was true, then sooner or later a decision would have to be made by someone, and when that moment came, I intended to be ready. I stopped waiting for the right moment and started creating one, because the truth was simple. No one was coming to offer me a chance. I had to position myself where chances happened, and that meant stepping beyond what I had always done. One evening after finishing my shift, I did not open the delivery app right away. Instead, I sat in my car and searched for local real estate meetups, small groups, nothing fancy, just people talking about deals, numbers, properties. I found one meeting, scheduled at a community center 10 miles away. I hesitated for a second, then drove there anyway. The room was smaller than I expected, maybe 12 people sitting around folding tables, some older, some younger. All speaking a language I was just beginning to understand: cap rates, cash flow, equity. I did not say much, I just listened, taking notes quietly, trying to connect what they were saying to what I had been learning on my own. One man mentioned buying a property that others overlooked because it looked too complicated. He said the numbers mattered more than appearances. That stayed with me, because my building looked worn, overlooked. But the numbers behind it were starting to tell a different story. After the meeting, I stayed behind for a moment, not to impress anyone, just to ask one question: how do you start when you do not have enough? The man looked at me and said, you do not wait until you have enough. You find a way to bring value to the deal. Knowledge, effort, management, something that makes others willing to work with you. I thanked him and walked out. The night air felt different, not lighter, but clearer. Like the path ahead had shape even if it was still long. Over the next few weeks, I kept going back to those meetings, listening more than talking, learning how deals were structured, how people partnered, how risk was shared. I began to understand that ownership was not always about having all the money. Sometimes it was about knowing how to put the pieces together. At the same time, I kept building my own foundation. My credit score moved again, 620 now. Small but steady progress. My savings grew slowly. Every extra shift, every expense cut adding to it. I called the credit union again, this time asking more specific questions about small multi-unit properties, about what lenders looked for in a borrower who was still building their profile. They explained debt-to-income ratios, reserves, documentation. I wrote everything down. Every requirement became a target, something I could work toward instead of something that felt out of reach. Back at the building, the signs of pressure were becoming more visible. A notice posted about maintenance delays. Another unit left empty without any sign of renovation. Conversations among tenants growing more uncertain. I continued observing, documenting, not reacting, because I understood now that timing mattered. Rushing would only close doors. Patience would open them. One late night after finishing deliveries, I sat at my table again. Papers spread out, notes from meetings, numbers from my own tracking, information about the building. I started putting it together, not as a dream, but as a possibility, a scenario where someone could step in if the owner needed to exit quickly. Someone who understood the condition of the property, the tenants, the risks, the potential. I did not know if that someone could be me yet, but for the first time it did not feel impossible. It felt like something that required preparation, consistency, and the willingness to act when others hesitated. I closed my notebook and looked around the apartment, the same walls, the same worn carpet, the same quiet space, but it no longer defined me. It was just where I started. And as I turned off the light and got ready for a few hours of sleep before the next day began, I knew one thing for certain. I was no longer just surviving inside this building. I was learning how it worked, and sooner or later, that knowledge was going to matter. I knew the moment was getting closer, not because anything dramatic happened, but because the silence around the situation started to feel different, like something was about to shift. One afternoon when I came home earlier than usual, I noticed a man in a suit standing near the office with a clipboard. Not a tenant, not maintenance, someone else. Someone who did not belong to the everyday routine of the building. He walked slowly, looking at the exterior walls, checking numbers on the doors, taking notes. I did not approach him. I just observed from a distance, the same way I had trained myself to do over the past months. That evening I saw my landlord arrive and go straight into the office. No usual small talk, no casual attitude, just focused. Tense, I stayed in my car for a few extra minutes, watching the lights through the window, shadows moving back and forth, voices low but serious. I could not hear the words, but I understood the tone. Something was happening, something that went beyond late repairs or rent increases. Later that night, a new notice appeared on the bulletin board, not for tenants this time. It was more formal, referencing a pending review, financial obligations, and a timeline that seemed tighter than anything posted before. Most people walked past it without a second glance, but I stood there long enough to read every line, slowly, carefully, letting each word sink in. This was not speculation anymore, it was confirmation. Pressure had reached a point where decisions would have to be made, real ones, the kind that changed ownership, the kind that created openings. I went back to my apartment and sat at my table, the same place where everything had started to shift for me. I opened my notebook and began writing again, but this time the notes felt different, less like observation and more like preparation. I listed what I knew, the condition of the property, the number of units, the vacancy rate I had tracked, the visible issues that could be improved. Then I listed what I needed: access to capital, a partner with experience, a clear plan to stabilize the building. I stared at the page for a long moment, then picked up my phone and scrolled through the contacts I had slowly built from the meetups, people I had spoken to briefly, people who might remember me as the one who listened more than she talked. I hesitated for only a second before sending a message, simple, direct, asking if they were open to discussing a potential opportunity involving a distressed multi-unit property. I did not expect immediate responses, but within an hour one reply came through, then another, both asking for more details. I kept my answers concise, factual, no exaggeration. Just what I had observed and documented over time. The next day during my break I stepped outside and took one of the calls, explaining the situation in a calm, steady voice, outlining what I knew and what I believed could be done. The person on the other end did not dismiss me, did not question why someone like me was bringing this forward. Instead, they asked about numbers, timelines, potential returns, questions I was ready to answer because I had done the work. When the call ended, I stood there for a moment, letting the reality of it settle in. This was no longer just learning, no longer just preparation. This was the beginning of something real, something that could move quickly if all the pieces aligned. That night I did not drive for as many hours as usual. I went home earlier and organized everything, notes, documents, contacts. I reviewed it all with a focus I had never had before. Because I knew that when opportunity finally appeared it would not wait, it would move fast, and I had to be ready to move with it, not as someone hoping for a chance, but as someone prepared to take one. The call came in earlier than I expected, just after 9 in the morning while I was sitting at the front desk. I recognized the number and stepped outside before answering. The voice on the other end was calm, direct, the kind of voice that did not waste time. He said they had reviewed the information I sent and wanted to move quickly. The owner was under pressure and considering options, including a fast sale below market value. I listened carefully, not interrupting, letting every word settle. This was the moment I had been preparing for without knowing exactly when it would arrive. He asked if I was ready to move forward if the numbers made sense. I said yes, not loudly, not dramatically, just a clear answer. Because anything else would have closed the door before it even opened. The rest of the day moved differently. Everything looked the same on the surface, but inside I was focused in a way I had never been before. I finished my shift, got into my car, and drove straight to the meeting location they had set. A small office space with glass walls and a quiet atmosphere. I walked in wearing the same clothes I always wore. Nothing special, nothing that announced anything had changed. But I carried something different now: preparation, understanding, purpose. We sat at a simple table, papers laid out in front of us, numbers, projections, conditions of the property, timelines that felt tight but possible. They asked questions and I answered them, not perfectly, but honestly, backed by everything I had observed and documented over months: vacancy rates, maintenance issues, potential improvements. I did not try to sound like something I was not. I just spoke from what I knew, and that was enough. Because I had done the work, the conversation shifted from possibility to structure, from what if to how. They explained how the deal could be arranged: a partnership, shared responsibility, shared risk, a plan to stabilize the building and increase its value over time. I listened, asked questions when I needed clarity, and stayed grounded. Because this was not a dream, it was a decision, one that would require everything I had been building toward. At one point they paused and looked at me, asking if I was ready to commit, really commit. Not just to the idea but to the process, the responsibility, the uncertainty that came with it. I thought about the nights in my car, the mornings counting dollars, the conversations that told me where I belonged and where I did not, and I realized something simple. I had already been carrying uncertainty for years. The only difference now was that this uncertainty had direction. I nodded and said yes, again, steady, without hesitation. The next few hours moved fast, faster than anything I had experienced before. Documents reviewed, terms agreed upon, timeline set. It was not final yet, but it was in motion, real and moving. When I walked out of that office, the sun was already low, the air warmer than it had been in the morning. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine, not to celebrate, not to react, just to absorb what had just happened. Then I drove back to the building, parked in the same spot I always used, and looked up at the structure that had defined so much of my life. The same walls, the same windows, but everything about it felt different now, not because it had changed yet, but because I had, and as I turned off the engine and stepped out into the evening light, I understood that the next 24 hours would matter more than anything that came before, because this was no longer preparation, this was execution. The next morning arrived without any announcement, no dramatic moment, no sudden change in the air, just the same sunlight coming through the same window, but everything underneath it had shifted. I woke up before the alarm and sat on the edge of the bed for a moment, letting the weight of what was about to happen settle into something steady. Something controlled. I got dressed the same way I always did, simple, practical, nothing that suggested anything different, because this was not about appearance, it was about action. I drove to the office where the final documents were waiting. The roads looked the same, the traffic moved the same, but my focus was sharper, clearer than it had ever been before. When I walked into the room, the papers were already laid out, organized, precise, every number, every condition, every responsibility defined. I sat down and read through everything again, line by line, not rushing, not skipping, because this was the moment where preparation met reality. When they handed me the pen, it did not feel heavy, it felt familiar. Like all the nights of writing numbers and plans had led to this one simple motion. I signed my name once, then again where required, each signature quiet, controlled, final. There was no applause, no reaction, just a handshake. A confirmation that the process was complete. The building had changed hands, and I was now part of that ownership. I stepped outside into the morning light and paused for a second, not to celebrate, but to acknowledge the shift, because everything after this would be different. Not easier, but different. When I returned to the property later that day, nothing had physically changed. The walls were the same, the paint still worn, the empty units still empty, but the way people looked at the place had already started to move. Word travels quickly in spaces like this, and by the afternoon the property manager had called a small meeting, explaining that new ownership was in place and that improvements would begin soon. I stood in the back, not speaking, just observing, the same way I always had. But this time the position was different. This time I understood every part of what was being said, because I was part of the reason it was happening. Later that evening I walked past the office again and saw my former landlord standing outside, speaking with someone in a low voice, his posture not as certain as before, his tone more measured. He glanced at me briefly, recognition passing across his face, but there was no confrontation, no words exchanged, just a quiet understanding of what had changed. I continued walking, not stopping, because there was nothing to prove, nothing to say. The shift spoke for itself. Over the next few days work began, inspections, repairs scheduled. Plans set in motion to stabilize what had been neglected for so long. I spent time reviewing details, learning more, stepping into responsibilities I had only studied before. It was not easy. There were challenges, decisions that required attention. But none of it felt overwhelming, because it was built on everything I had already been doing in silence. One evening I stood in the parking lot as the sun went down, looking at the building again. The same structure that had once represented limitation now stood as something else entirely, something that reflected not where I was stuck, but where I had stepped forward. I thought about all the moments that led here, the small choices, the quiet discipline, the decision to observe instead of react, to learn instead of accept, and I realized that nothing had changed overnight in the way people imagine. The overnight moment was just the point where all the unseen work finally became visible. I turned back toward the entrance and walked inside. Not as someone passing through, but as someone responsible for what came next, and in that quiet shift, everything had already changed.